Where do we see the concept of race put under interrogation in the novel, and how? Right? How does race operate in this novel? One of the best known passages, and probably the best place to begin answering such questions, or producing some prompts that may lead us to answering these questions in a rigorous and robust interpretation of passing, occurs at the beginning of part 2 of the novel, the part encountered. Oh my gosh, I'm switching words all over the place here today. The part entitled Re-Encounter. Okay, that starts on page 35 of this edition. I want to read a couple of paragraphs that anticipate a conversation between Irene and her husband Brian a few pages later, because this is sort of indicative of the way in which Larsen thinks through issues, right? She anticipates scenes a few pages before, or sometimes even dozens of pages before really pertinent moments in the plot, right? So at this moment in the novel, we are caught up to what we might call the present, and Irene is, I almost said obsessing over the letter, but really, I'm not sure that's the right word, but nevertheless thinking a great deal about the letter that Claire has sent her, expressing a desire to see her and to reconnect with Black culture in particular, right? So anyway, so I'm going to read these paragraphs on 36 and quit stalling. Mingled with her disbelief and resentment was another feeling, a question. Why hadn't she spoken that day? And by that day, we're referring to when she met Claire's husband back in Chicago. Why, in the face of Bellu's ignorant hate and aversion, had she concealed her own origin? Why had she allowed him to make his assertions and express his misconceptions undisputed? Why, simply because of Claire Kendry, who had exposed her to such torment, had she failed to take up the defense of the race to which she belonged? This important matter of belonging is going to come full circle a few paragraphs later. Irene asked these questions, felt them. They were, however, merely rhetorical, as she herself was well aware. She knew their answers, every one, and it was the same for them all. The sardony of it! She couldn't betray Claire, couldn't even run the risk of appearing to defend a people that were being maligned, for fear that that defense might in some infinitesimal degree lead the way to final discovery of her, that is, Claire's secret. She had to Claire Kendry a duty. Be returning to this in the next video. She was bound to her by those very ties of race, which, for all her repudiation of them, Claire had been unable to completely sever. This is an interesting figuration of race, as ties that bind. Ties one can repudiate but not sever. Ties that impose a kind of duty, right? Anyway, we will continue. And it wasn't, as Irene knew, that Claire cared at all about the race, or what was to become of it. She didn't. Or that she had for any of its members great or even real affection, though she professed undying gratitude for the small kindness which the Westover family had shown her when she was a child. Irene doubted the genuineness of it, seeing herself only as a means to an end where Claire was concerned. Nor could it be said that she had even the slightest artistic or sociological interest in the race that some members of other races displayed. She hadn't. No, Claire Kendry cared nothing for the race. She only belonged to it. That's what I meant by coming full circle about in terms of belonging, another concept in terms of race that Larsen seems to be prompting us to consider with her in terms of what this category is, what it means, and how it affects people in a bunch of kind of incoherent ways. Okay. one thing to point out is that this is an important moment in which we might distrust the narrative perspective of the story and ask ourselves, to what degree is Irene projecting onto Claire a kind of self-judgment, right? We see this in an article we talked about at the end of, not the end of class, but during our last class. It was an article that you were to have read that really meditates on this idea a little bit. It really meditates on this idea a little bit. Anyway, turning the page, those are just the paragraphs that anticipate this conversation with Brian. Claire says to him near the bottom of 38, he actually walks in at the bottom of 36, but now they're having coffee together. I'm going to write to Claire, Irene says. Today, if I can find a minute. It's a thing we might as well settle definitely and immediately. Curious, isn't it, that knowing as she does his unqualified attitude, she's still, right, so Irene's still thinking about Bello. Brian interrupted, it's always that way. Never known it to fail. Remember Albert Hammond? How he used to be forever haunting 7th Avenue and Lenox Avenue and the dancing places until some shine took a shot at him for casting an eye towards his Sheba? There's an explanatory note at the bottom of the page for that passage. They always come back. I've seen it happen time and time again. But why? Irene wanted to know. Why? Interesting question. If I knew that, Brian answers, or responds, I'd know what race is. This is one of the most quoted sentences in the novel. If I knew that, I'd know what race is, right? The way in which for the characters in the novel, they talk about race and make a lot of assumptions about what race is, though when pressed to define it, none of them really know, right, what it is. But wouldn't you think that having got the thing or things they were after, and at such risk they'd be satisfied or afraid? Yes, Brian agreed. You certainly would think so. But the fact remains they aren't. Not satisfied, I mean. I think they're scared enough most of the time when they give way to the urge and slip back. Not scared enough to stop them, though. Why? The good God only knows. Irene leaned forward, speaking, she was aware, with a vehemence absolutely unnecessary. So why unnecessary? Why is Irene so invested in this question of those who pass, who have a desire to come back, right? What implications does that have for this category of race, or for the color line, or for the cultural conditions that generate the kind of double consciousness that Du Bois theorizes back in the very early 20th century? Well, Claire can just count me out. I've no intention of being the link between her and her poorer, darker brethren. After that scene in Chicago, too, to calmly expect me? She stopped short, suddenly too wrathful for words. Quite right, the only sensible thing to do. Let her miss you, Brian responds. It's unhealthy business, the whole affair, always is. Irene nodded. More coffee, she offered. More coffee, she offered. Thanks, no. He took up his paper again, spreading it open with a little rattling noise. Zulania, who is described on the earlier page as a small mahogany-colored creature, came in bringing more toast. Brian took a slice and bit into it with that audible crunching sound that Irene disliked so intensely and turned back to his paper. She said, it's funny about passing. I'm always fascinated by passages in novels that you could think of as the title track of the novel, right? The moment, or one of the moments where the very title of the novel appears in the text of the novel itself. We disapprove of it and at the same time condone it. It excites our contempt, and yet we rather admire it. We shy away from it with an odd kind of revulsion, but we protect it. We shy away from it, I should have done, but we protect it. Instinct of the race, to survive and expand, Brian responds. Rot, everything can't be explained by some general biological phrase. Absolutely everything can, he responds over breakfast. Look at the so-called whites, who've left bastards all over the known earth. It's Brian's summation of the history of imperialism and colonialism. Same thing in them. Instinct of the race, to survive and expand. Within one page, why did I read these passages? Because within one page, right, anticipated by Irene's own meditations on the category of race, to which she belongs but can't be severed, which she can repudiate but never escape, right? Brian goes from completely undermining what race is, right? If I knew that, then I'd know what race is, right? Is it a biological category, a natural one, a genetic, a social, a moral, a constructed, an arbitrary one, right? He goes from not knowing what it means to asserting something fundamental about it, something evolutionary, essential, urgent, right? An impulse to survive and expand. This undecidable oscillation between knowing and not knowing, right, is actually programmatic of how the book itself deals with race, how the phenomenon which titles the novel, passing, operates as a way within the pages of the novel and in the cultural context in which the novel was written, how passing operates as a way for many Black Americans to negotiate the color line, to theorize the color line, whether explicitly or implicitly, to manage their double consciousness, if we accept Du Bois's term, and to disclose, in doing so, the very arbitrariness of it. We might say that the novel itself, through its textual practice, unfolds an argument akin to the following passage from our textbook, Parker, right? Quote, "The dominant culture," those are my words, "would have us," these are his words, "would have us believe that racial difference comes from biology. But the biology of race is a cultural fiction. As a hegemonic," we'll talk about hegemony later, "as a hegemonic cultural fiction, the idea that race is biological is so deeply entrenched that most people take it for granted, as unquestioned fact. But biologists say the opposite, that people of different races usually have more in common genetically than people of the same race." Sorry, that's my email ding. "The markers of race, such as skin color and hair texture, have a visual convenience." It's important. Visuality is so important in this novel, right? Those are Parker's words, but we can sort of transpose them onto Larsen in a sense that visibility is so important. But otherwise, even despite its visual convenience, skin color holds little biological meaning compared with other genetic variables. Historical and cultural conventions attribute vast significance to those markers, to skin color, to hair texture. But nothing requires us to see them as so meaningful. Though they certainly can be, right? In and of itself, it isn't necessarily a bad thing if they hold great significance. But in terms of how it's managed and negotiated and regulated in culture, it leads to incredible inequalities and incredible inequality and injustice. Still, the superficial markers of race offer a convenient tool for colonialism and racism. This is Parker's point, which desperately seek to naturalize abusive power relations, meaning to make these imbalances that I just talked about part of a belief in the natural order of things, right? And to not see it as the contingent effect of violence that they've perpetrated, right? Instead, they suppose that they discover differences between peoples that in many ways they've actually imposed. In unfolding, that's Parker, in unfolding an argument about race that resonates with this passage from Parker, however, Larsen's novel does not do away with the term. I've sort of suggested this earlier in the last video. Just because race is taken to be, or in some sense disclosed to be, a constructed, undecidable, and even undefinable term, right, or phenomenon for the novel's characters, as a source of anxiety, frustration, and pride, depending on what passage one is reading, race is not any less real, right, even if it is constructed. So what do I mean by that? It might be important to turn back to Parker. So this is on page 304 to 305 from his chapter on post-colonial and race studies. He writes, quote, "To say that race or any particular race is not a biological or essential category, as he's just argued a few pages earlier, does not mean that race does not exist. Instead, it changes our understanding of how race exists. It changes race from something biological or essential to something historical. In that sense, the idea that racial categories are constructed, that the ties of race that Larsen is talking about are constructed ones, not natural or essential ones, right, can help us resist racist ideas, understand race itself, and understand individual races. Many critics, he continues, try to get at the way race is an ongoing process in construction, by referring at least some of the time to racialized peoples or groups rather than to races. The term racialization suggests something that is done to people, right? In some sense, is about the lines of color that are drawn in cultures. While the term race can suggest, by contrast, something that people purportedly are. And it's interesting to note that different quote-unquote races or ethnicities are racialized in different ways, right? In the United States, for instance, at a certain point, and it was right before, in some sense, rather recent history for the lives of people living in the cultural context of this novel, right? There was the notion of the one-drop rule, right? That even if you had one drop of quote-unquote African blood, that you were considered black, right? Whereas when we think of Indian or Native Americans, right, there's the idea of percentages, right? So you see that, I mean, that's just those are the laws of determination rather than comments on sort of racist ideas people have about people belonging to those racial categories. But nevertheless, it demonstrates, right, at least even numerically, the degree to which different peoples are racialized differently. Okay. Racialization indicates that we too often see racialized people through the lens of preconceptions and cultural patterns about race, as if race were a stable fact and not a continually shifting and provisional construction. This is still Parker. Because of racialization, individual people can get defined by preconceptions about a group they belong to, making it harder for others and even for the individuals themselves to see their individuality. In turn, because racialization masks individuals, it also risks distorting the groups they belong to, reducing each group to uniformity and stereotype by erasing variations across the group. We can see, a sort of both funny, disheartening, and frustrating example of this in the scene where Claire actually asks John Bello, "Oh, do you actually know any Negroes?" Right after he first shows that he's explicitly a racist. And he says, "Well, no, but I know people who do, or I read the papers, right?" So this is remarkably important when we pose questions about how people become racialized, how they lose their singularity and individuality because of the way in which, right, caricatures sort of branch out and infect our cultural perceptions of entire groups of people, right? This continues to be the case with especially in recent news media with the poor, right? There is a way in which poverty itself is racialized or de-racialized depending on what channel you're watching, or we sort of pretend that poverty isn't also a racial issue. But anyway, that's me going off on a tangent. Anyway, what I had hoped to do by reading those passages from Parker and introducing those ideas to you after having talked about that passage from passing, is to help you see the ways in which the novel, according to its very textual practice, not according to the ideas of the characters necessarily, but according to the way in which the novel itself is unfolding, right, perspectives on and frustrations, anxieties, and concerns about the idea of race, that the novel itself is forming something of an argument, or at the very least is problematizing and giving us occasion to worry about how naturalized and essentialized that category is, and continues to be for many of us in the 21st century. Okay, in the next video, I want to spend just a little bit of time talking about the article at the end of the book, and also a few pages near the end of the novel where race comes back again for Irene, comes back around, and may shed some light on some of those earlier passages that I read in this video. Okay.